Good afternoon, and welcome back to our continuing conversations on South Carolina history. When we stopped our last conversation, we were talking about South Carolina and another New South. And for most historians and economists, when you talk about a New South, you're talking about economic development. And South Carolina began in the 1950s to really look seriously at industrialization. It began during the term of Governor Timmerman. He didn't really care much about it, so he turned all of that over to his lieutenant governor, Ernest Fritz Hollings, who certainly took the bit in his teeth and helped create the modern industrial development feeling and bureaucracy that we have today. One of the things that they really looked at was the State Sports Authority. It had been created in 1942 during the war, so it really didn't get started until after the war. But no steamship line in 1945 actually stopped in Charleston. No regular steamship. By 1948, there were 36. Imports increased, exports increased, the number of ships doubled. And Charleston by the 1950s was ranked as the 15th most active port in the United States. And Georgetown was developed as a secondary port. And the state, in today's dollars, invested almost $500 million in the ports in Charleston and Georgetown. That was a very far-sighted move because containerized shipping was just on the horizon. Others saw what was happening and didn't necessarily appreciate South Carolina's efforts. The New York World Telegram, that's a really old newspaper, but it was still in existence in the 50s, said, "In Charleston's mercurial growth is reflected South Carolina's determination to get rid of the old mockingbird and magnolia psychology in favor of an up-to-date, two-fisted competitive spirit." I love that phrase, mockingbird and magnolia psychology. We always talk about moonlighting magnolias, but mockingbird and magnolias. And I'm sorry, sometimes I have segues that things will just pop up. Mockingbird. Years ago, I had a couple of good friends on the faculty at the University of Virginia, and they were talking about hiring someone in Southern history. And they had this esteemed candidate come to campus. Lots of publications and whatever. And as they're walking across campus, he pointed and said, "What is that strange looking bird?" Well, it was a mockingbird. And the staff at UVA said, well, if he's going to teach Southern history and culture and doesn't know what a mockingbird is, we will look elsewhere for an appointment. So, anyway, you don't have to be a member of the Audubon Society to know what a mockingbird looks like. And we've got lots of them out here at Stillhouse. There's one that has a nest right in the shrub, right by the bistro deck. It just so happened in 1955 that there were devastating floods in the state of Connecticut. And Governor Timmerman happened to be there on a previously planned recruiting trip. A Connecticut editor accused South Carolina of reverse carpetbagging, sending people north to recruit industry to take advantage of Connecticut's distress. And the governor of Connecticut said, "The South is fighting the Civil War all over again in trying to take away our industry. They're on the make." Also in 1955, U.S. trade negotiators made deep tariff concessions to the Japanese that would permit the importation of large quantities of Japanese textiles. Now we're the textile state, the largest textile producing state in the country. South Carolina newspapers, legislators, and textile executives acted as if they had been shot. In the press, compared it to Pearl Harbor, this Japanese attack on Southern textiles. In March 1956, the General Assembly passed an act requiring wholesale and retail establishments in South Carolina that sold Japanese textiles to display conspicuously a sign, "Japanese textiles sold here." Within weeks, merchants in the upstate, Lancaster, Chester, so forth, textile towns, announced they wouldn't sell Japanese textiles in any form. The press, in reporting layoffs at the mills, referred to them as Japanese vacations. The Japanese ambassador made a formal complaint about South Carolina to the State Department. President Eisenhower and his administration ignored the Southern textile industry. One U.S. trade official was quoted in the press as regretting South Carolina's law. But in September 1956, the Japanese government voluntarily agreed to extend their own self-imposed textile quotas. Governor Timmerman said, "Since the government in Washington refused to protect the welfare of our people, it is gratifying to learn that the government of Japan is not equally indifferent." The best thing, of course, that Timmerman did was to turn economic development over to Fritz Hollings. And once elected in his own right after Timmerman, that meant for 6 years he pretty much was running South Carolina's economic development. He understood that South Carolina had to come up with an improved product, the state and its people, to sell to investors. He had some pre-inaugural remarks to the press. One idea I want to develop is that we were elected because the people wanted a working governor. My work will be cut out for me in securing new industry, and we can't be diverted into every luncheon group, beauty contest, and state convention. I want to tell these groups to go to hell diplomatically so we can work with the General Assembly on the industrial problem. And what he was saying is, up until he had this, it was the governor's job to go to the Peach Festival, to crown Miss Watermelon Queen, speak at the Kiwanis Club. Yes, you might continue to do some of that, but it was more important to be recruiting industry than these nice civic activities. The result was, pressed by Hollings and the Barnwell Ring, that coterie of very powerful politicians, Saul Blott in the House, Edgar Brown in the Senate, Fritz Hollings was their buddy. During the 1959 session, so much legislation was passed that the state newspaper called it the industrial session. They amended the tax laws of the state. Income tax withholding was put into effect. The top tax bracket was raised to 7%. They eliminated the sales tax on electricity. To make up for the difference, they put a 2-cent tax on cigarettes. Now, this didn't come easily. There was a lot of opposition to the income tax. Charles Daniel, the industrialist from Greenville, preferred a regressive sales tax instead of an income tax. But what Fritz Hollings was proposing passed a combination, interestingly, of the Barnwell wing and progressive politicians from the urban areas. The McNair West Committee, these future governors, were now in the General Assembly, McNair in the House, West in the Senate. The legislature created the McNair West Committee, a joint legislative committee, to study the State Development Board. It recommended a thorough reorganization, and it was done. The offices of the State Development Board were moved next to the governor. Of course, they didn't take up a lot of space in those days. Now they have lots of office space. But literally, the State Development Board director had his office right next to the governor in the basement of the State House. Industry hunting safaris is what they called them, to go out and recruit industry involving the state's business leaders. Another McNair-West Committee proposal was to study technical education. It recommended a system of technical schools across the state. Again, there was a lot of opposition to this. Now, there's an apocryphal story that was floating around, and I can tell you it's no longer apocryphal because Governor Hollings told me that it happened, and it was confirmed by a member of Senator Edgar Brown's family. Edgar Brown was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. If he didn't approve it, it wasn't going to happen. Supposedly, Fritz got a bottle of the best bourbon and walked from the governor's office up to Senator Brown's office, and he returned to the governor's mansion with an empty bottle and the outline of a tech system. Senator Brown was on board. He had drafted the plan on the back of an envelope. That was the beginning of our technical education system in South Carolina. It improved job skills for tens of thousands of South Carolinians, and part of this tech system, and I think I mentioned it last week, was that the state, if you're going to move your industry to Barnwell County or Greenwood County, and a particular production line is required, we will train those workers at the local tech school at state expense, so that when they get through that program, they can move straight into your industry, and that increases your productivity, and lowers your costs. The State Development Board budget was $5 million, and that's in today's money. Folks, that doesn't get you very far. It was making loans to new industrial projects, to expanding existing plants, if they were going to create new jobs. Now, I realize today those kind of programs are under a lot of scrutiny and so forth. But back then, it made a difference in getting production plants, especially to small towns. He got it increased more than triple to $16 million. That's still a lot of money. That's $16 million in our dollars today. It helped small business, and it brought jobs to rural South Carolina. During the Hollings years, the state's financial house was put in order. That was something that Senator Brown always was concerned about, our state AAA bond rating. You have a sound financial footing, that's going to be a positive for business. They created the tech system that would boost development efforts for generations to come, the reorganized development board, and they supported local entrepreneurship. Succeeded in building a public-private development coalition that worked together for decades. And that's important, public and private together, because when the governor went off on a recruiting trip, or a safari, as Fritz started calling them, they took business leaders. It wasn't just the development board and state officials. Had a tremendous impact in recruiting. And because South Carolina, at least in the early 60s, in terms of the civil rights movement, was fairly violence or demonstration free, South Carolina promoted its social stability. Now that would change, but that made South Carolina different from places like Arkansas and Mississippi, where hardcore, die-hard white Southerners were not going to make any changes. After Hollings, you have Governor McNair, the Campbell. I haven't omitted Governor Ross. I'll mention him in a minute, but he was only there for 2 years. All the governors worked within the Hollings model. They were basically the CEO, the chief executive officer of the state. The state was a business and they were the CEO, working closely with the development board. And they tweaked the system to improve the product, the state. Governor Russell, when he campaigned on the slogan, "A job, that's the problem, and that's the real campaign issue." Interestingly, because he, and I think this is not too strong, he despised Fritz Hollings. Hollings had beaten him, and every time they'd come head to head, Hollings would beat him, and he would beat him again for the Senate. And one of the things that Hollings proposed doing, the legislation was already in the State House, was to create the Star Professor program at Clemson in Carolina to bring in renowned researchers who could attract students and business. Governor Russell, who had been president of the university, scrubbed the project. It was one of those missed opportunities in South Carolina history. Of course, we have the Distinguished Professor program now, but it costs a whole lot more money than it would have back in the 1950s had it been implemented. Now, he was only in office 2 years because Senator Olin D. Johnson died and Donald Russell wanted to be senator, so he resigned and Bob McNair became governor, and Bob McNair appointed Donald Russell to the Senate. At the next general election, which was required, Fritz Hollings ran against Donald Russell and beat him, knocked him out of the Senate. Under McNair, there was a penny sales tax for education. There you get to the idea again of improving our product. We've got to make better education opportunities for our kids. So, a penny for education. Now it's interesting if you look back at all of the sales tax, 3 cents under Jimmy Burns, 1 cent under McNair, later on under Dick Riley. It's all been for education. But once the tax is there, the General Assembly can spend it any way they choose. McNair also reorganized the Ports Authority to make it more competitive. And under John West, moderation went a long way in South Carolina, again in comparison with other southern states. And his ties to the National Democratic Party were beneficial to the state in terms of appropriations, and of course for him resulted eventually in an ambassadorship to Saudi Arabia. Excuse me, I'm getting ready. Sorry. For historians, what has happened since the 1980s is really not history. I'm sorry. But briefly, with governors that followed John West, under Governor Edwards, the Education Finance Act was a very important piece of legislation, because under that, more money went to rural schools on a percentage basis than it was not just an across the board X number of dollars per kid. He also strengthened the alliance between business and the state. Dick Riley came up as our first 2-term governor. The Education Improvement Act, which built upon the Education Finance Act, did make a difference in our educational system. Although the law is on the books, funding has never been fully implemented since the 1980s. The law is there, it just hasn't been implemented. There was also tax credits to locate companies in poorer counties. One was Mack Truck in Fairfield County, and that was a big to-do, but then about 8 years later, Mack Truck closed up. Under Campbell, a man who really, excuse me, I gotta. Under Governor Campbell, he was a man who relished his role as an industry recruiter. He trimmed the capital gains tax in the state, and he implemented a plan to charge fees in lieu of property taxes for business. And his biggest catch was BMW. Now, we have had a lot of economic development since the Campbell administration. Boeing, Port of Charleston, Volvo, but like I say, folks, that's kind of current events. I really think with the Campbell administration, we talk about New Souths, that's kind of a nice way to wrap up modern South Carolina, because really since then, industrial recruiting has not changed much. We're still looking for manufacturing, what they call smokestack chasing. We haven't done that well with high tech. And South Carolina's position economically vis-a-vis the other states in the Union, we've stuck at about 80% of the national average in terms of per capita income. But you know what? That still leaves us as one among the 10 poorest states in the Union. Do I have an answer? Well, I can tell you, and I've said this in front of elected officials, including the governor, is that when I wrote the history of South Carolina, I read every governor's State of the State address, an inaugural address from 1900 to 1996. And every one of them said, we've got to improve education. They're still saying, we've got to improve education. Education is the future, ladies and gentlemen. And on that note, I will say, right now we'll sign off on this part of South Carolina history, but in about 6 weeks we'll be coming back with selected topics in South Carolina history, ranging from such things as colonial women to the Goose Creek men, just sort of whatever catches my fancy. Okay? Thank you, it's been a pleasure.